What follows is a segment of video which would play at the start of a number of Anime 18 titles released on VHS from 1996 to 2002. If you are unfamiliar with this period of anime distribution in the US, Anime 18 was the adult label for works licensed by Central Park Media. This segment includes the FBI warning, viewer discretion warning, no minors statement, and a short video essay called The Anime Artform. Owing to the nature of YouTube, I have censored the few moments of brief nudity, but have a watch, and we'll pick up on the other side.
If you are new to Japanese animation, please take a minute to learn about the cultural and historical background which gives this art form its unique character. Japanese animation is often referred to as Japanimation or anime. You will notice very non-Japanese looking characters with vibrant hair colors such as yellows, reds, and blues, as well as distinctive hairstyles such as pigtails, ponytails, and decorative ribbons. In many cases, these hairstyles are exaggerated beyond the laws of physics. These traits are used in Japanese animation as techniques to easily differentiate the characters. It is far easier to tell characters apart when they have strikingly different hair colors and styles. Since many women in Japan wear such hairstyles and accessories, including many singers and actresses in their 20s and 30s, such styles are commonplace in the culture. Other frequent images in Japanimation include school uniforms such as sailor-style blouses, skirt and blazer outfits, and bloomer-style exercise clothes. School uniforms have been mandatory in Japan dating back to the late 1800s and were influenced by uniforms used in countries such as Germany and Victorian England. Students of all ages, primary school to university, wore uniforms until World War II. All students wearing uniforms in Anime 18 videos are attending a 2-year Takidagaku short-term college, as opposed to a full 4-year university, most of which no longer require uniforms. One question we are frequently asked is, why are their eyes so large? This technique dates back to the original Western influence on Japan of animated characters such as Betty Boop and early Walt Disney characters of the 1930s. Since then, big eyes have developed into a standard feature of almost all animation and manga comic book characters in Japan. Indeed, many US comic book characters fail to sell well in Japan because their small eyes are considered unfriendly or too cold by many Japanese. Some Westerners wonder why voice actresses in anime videos often have such high-pitched voices.
God, what's her deal?
This is also a cultural phenomenon. Such voices are seen in Japan as more attractive and feminine. Many Japanese companies specifically instruct the receptionists and female sales assistants to use a high-pitched voice when dealing with customers.
I feel really powerful.
A note about a more private matter. You will notice a lack of pubic hair on almost every character, male and female, whether age 19 or 90. This trait of the art form reflects the fact that until very recently, any depiction of pubic hair in a photograph or drawing was illegal in Japan. Although in the mid-1990s, this became somewhat relaxed in terms of live photos. The Japanimation industry has adopted an informal consensus not to depict pubic hair in animated works, due to fears of adverse public and government reaction. Thank you for supporting the Anime Artform.
Considering that the Anime Artform was released in 1996, it's a remarkably informative artifact of early licensed English language anime distribution. It has a number of rather dated inaccuracies, of course, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be focusing on what I'll call kayfabe. You see, I have it on good authority that far more than being an informative little video, there are several assertions and claims that are made which were bulwarks against not only the possibility of a number of these hentai titles being banned, but also to keep Central Park Media from getting sued. So first, let's look at the messages. It's very important to acknowledge how much not getting sued was instrumental in every aspect of the distribution of pornographic anime during the 90s. It's terribly cliché now, but the popular perception that animation was a medium for children was in full force. So as ludicrous as it sounds, and maybe if the person watching the video got the cassettes without the box, it makes sense to include a final warning that this content is not intended for children. It turns out, content warnings also have a pretty early provenance. However, the load-bearing portion of this preface is the message that follows. It stipulates, in the strongest language possible, that everyone depicted in the nude or engaged in sexual activity was over the age of 18, and that any characters therein were not based on any identifiable minor. In terms of the video itself, there's some useful information for audiences who may not have been that familiar with anime. Why do their characters have large eyes? Why do they have colorful and unique hairstyles? Why are the female characters' voices so high-pitched? The most important piece of information, however, is the short section on the use of school uniforms, specifically the following piece of narration.
All students wearing uniforms in Anime 18 videos are attending a 2-year Takidegaku short-term college, as opposed to a full 4-year university, most of which no longer require uniforms.
While it is true that some junior colleges did require students to wear uniforms, this was usually dependent on the field of study, i.e. nursing, the vast majority did not. It is also important to know that this claim is absolutely false. The reason that the characters in Anime 18 titles appear in school uniforms and bloomer-style athletic wear isn't because they're attending particularly conservative junior colleges, it's because these characters were still in high school. The need for deception is, of course, owing to the legal necessity of representing the characters as being 18 years of age or older. But this is why, rather than characterizing it as a deception, understanding it through the rubric of kayfabe is far more useful. Kayfabe, if you are unfamiliar with the term, originated with professional wrestling and describes the need for wrestlers to maintain the persona of their characters at all times they could potentially be seen by the audience. Now, everyone is aware that it's all theatrics, the wrestlers, the promotion, even and especially the audience. But it is a collective fiction which is necessary for the illusion of professional wrestling to work, and so everyone buys in. So, these warnings and the anime art form are considered paratext, elements of textual production which exist outside the narrative of the text itself, in this case an OVA of ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟𝕟, but which nevertheless influences the production of meaning within that text. We've looked at the paratextual elements present on the video recording, but an equally important aspect is the way the cassettes themselves were advertised, so it's worth looking at a VHS slipcase produced by Anime 18, and I think the second volume of the OVA series The Blue Girl is a representative example. The front cover for both the subtitled and English dub for Volume 2 was originally the cover for the Japanese Volume 1. The image is the same, with the exception that on the Anime 18 version, the character's nipples are censored with a red bar with the word uncensored written on it. I've had to censor the original VHS slipcase for obvious reasons, but you can also appreciate that while little appears to be left to the imagination, key regions remain obscured, doing just that. The advertisements, which ran in magazines like Animerica, feature the front cover of the VHS slipcase, coupled with suggestive wording. Given the magazine, the target demographic would have been people already involved with anime to merit buying individual or subscriptions to hobbyist magazines, but approaching from the level of the individual consumer neglects a key aspect of video distribution in this period. This is because the major sales demographic for Anime 18 titles were independent adult video stores, more generalized video rental stores, and then individual consumers. So, while in a vacuum the design of these slipcases seem like an afterthought, ensuring the censoring of the art would be as limited as possible makes sense. You see, these cassettes were not meant to be on display outside of the AV section of those adult video stores. Environments where they had to not only catch the eye of a potential viewer while competing with cassettes which featured AV actresses, but to overcome the erotic animation barrier as well. AV film slipcases were also censored in this period. So it's interesting that Anime 18 slipcases utilize the existing format of AV cassette censorship while being able to leverage the unique visuals of the character art. The labels which adorn the box art, warning, absolutely not for children, also served a dual purpose. On the one hand, warning parents that even though this was animation, this was not appropriate content for children. And it may seem strange now, but most anime fans of a certain vintage will have a story about being able to find titles like Le Blue Girl or Urotsukudoji in the Japanimation or animation section of their local video store or regional rental chain. Of course, content warning labels also lend themselves to curiosity, if not enticement. What kind of sick stuff is going on in these videos that they need to be so clearly labeled? This was, after all, in the same era where parental advisory, explicit content had become a familiar sight on music deemed inappropriate for their teenaged audiences. So we can see the elements of kayfabe necessary for hentai to be made legally available for the North American market. Everyone depicted in the nude or in sexual acts is agreed to be aged 18 or older. This was performed at the textual level by aging the characters up through both the English language subtitles and audio track, paratextually through content warnings during the runtime of the video itself, labels on the cassette slipcase, and at the level of distribution by asserting that these were 18-plus titles. It was also incumbent on the audience to go along with this fiction, and for a significant portion of that viewership, the Anime Artform provides a plausible narrative to those who would have been unfamiliar with the original Japanese source material. As I mentioned earlier, the Anime Artform was released in 1996, accompanying several Anime 18 VHS dubs of works like Le Blue Girl, Twin Angels, and Venus 5. We know this because the short includes dubs from these series, and we know that they were dubbed in 1996 by Kip Kaplan through his company, Audio Works Producers Group, though Kaplan himself did not work on the short. Interestingly, the earliest English dub produced by Anime 18 was their cut of Urotsukudoji, Legend of the Overfiend, which was released theatrically in 1992 with both a subtitled and dubbed version, but this, as well as a number of their VHS releases which had Japanese dialogue and English subtitles, were produced prior to 1996. This raises the question of what precipitated the need to produce the short in the first place, especially as, in the case of Le Blue Girl, the series was released a year earlier. As information from the production is not forthcoming, Central Park Media filed for Chapter 7 in 2009, and former staff do not wish to discuss their involvement with the production of hentai, we are left to speculate on the specifics, though there are some clues. In notes from an interview from the Central Park Media panel at Anime Expo in 2000, Chris Beveridge noted, for the website DVD Vision Japan, that Central Park Media founder John O'Donnell explained, "I asked John about Le Blue Girl. It is indeed edited, but it wasn't always. When they did their first VHS release in 1995, it was uncut. Then the US passed a law in 1996 making it illegal to show any minor or anyone who appears to be a minor in sexual situations. Now, the law that was passed in 1996 was the CPPA, which made it a criminal offense to both produce any visual depiction of a minor, including computer-generated and virtual images, who were engaged in sexual activity, or produce any sexually explicit image that would imply that the individual depicted was a minor. I'll talk about this later, but since the timing matches up with the release of the Anime Artform, that it was produced as a response to the CPPA is a reasonable conclusion. Yet the fact that all of this was deemed necessary by the then largest distributor of anime to the North American market, simply to make hentai legally available, is worth treating seriously. In a later interview in 2003, O'Donnell stated, "We believe very strongly in your right to view hentai, if you wish. We also believe very strongly that you should not be exposed to this programming unless you are looking for it. We do not believe that it should be marketed in such a way that minors might be exposed to it by mistake." As it turns out, This decision by early anime distributors to be responsible corporate citizens, to bifurcate anime into those titles deemed pornographic and those titles which were everything else, would have a profound impact not only on the next 3 decades of anime distribution, but how fans would come to think about topics like sexuality, fan service, eroticism, and sex in their favorite media form. But that's a topic for another video. I'd like you to consider for a moment just what a wild and strange artifact this short video essay really is. It would be easy to reduce it to some weird cultural artifact produced in a bygone era for the sole purpose of making it easier to market anime, and hentai of all things. Yet, that it prefaces pornography is what makes it more than just a mere cultural artifact. Rather, the anime art form represents a node in the much larger media ecology which developed as anime distribution in North America expanded from a handful of small companies to the post-COVID mainstreaming of anime by large corporations. The anime art form demonstrates, quite explicitly, that far from being the inevitable fallout from insidious actors within the contemporary anime localization industry, the domestication of anime has always already been present in the distribution of anime to the Anglosphere. In contemporary discourse, the term for producing anime made for English-speaking audiences is most frequently localization. The term itself can be traced back to the importation of production manuals made suitable for a foreign readership. The image that pops up in my mind when thinking of examples would be the 4Kids release of the Pokemon television anime, where onigiri were presented as jelly donuts to make them representable to a presumed audience of American children.
These donuts are great! Jelly-filled are my favorite! Nothing beats a jelly-filled donut!
But a more interesting example would be the case of Miramax's release of Princess Mononoke. The line here, which sticks out in my mind, is when the monk ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟, voiced by Billy Bob Thornton, is eating soup purchased from a roadside vendor and remarks,
"Are you selling soup or donkey piss?"
In comparison, the more literal translation from the original Japanese could be rendered as, the line is a criticism pertaining to the insubstantial consistency of the gruel and the lack of value for a hungry traveler having paid for it. Thus, in order to capture ℍ𝕖𝕟's general disgust at both the taste and lack of substance, the replacement for hot water, not a terribly punchy turn of phrase, donkey piss, conveys both disgust as well as ℍ𝕖𝕟's predisposition to use humor to mask his ill intent. The noble donkey, of course, being naturally hilarious. Now, this analysis conveys an argument centered around concerns of translation, particularly the perspective of striking a balance between accurately conveying the message in the Japanese while being legible to an American audience. And if you spent time engaging with contemporary discussions and debates around localization among English-speaking anime fans, interminably the issue is reduced to concerns over translation. I'll be discussing this in greater detail in the last section, so for now, I'll only say that while translation is what sucks up all the oxygen in the room, this framing is deployed to privilege a discursive position which overdetermines how English anime fandom understands a much more complex process. The sociologist Casey Brienza offers a very cogent critique of relying on terms like translation and localization. Translation, she argues, while a necessary component of making media originally produced in Japan accessible to an English audience, is nevertheless a single component of a much larger process and can in fact work to obscure that process to the point of invisibility, a point I'll be returning to shortly. It is worth mentioning that Brienza's text, Manga in America, is, well, obviously an examination of the American manga publishing industry, though I'm certainly making the case that her theoretical model works just as well for the distribution of anime. She does note that among those in the industry, the term most frequently used to describe the process was localization, and as I mentioned earlier, this certainly extends to popular discourse among anime fans as well. There are, however, shortcomings to the use of this term, as Brienza outlines. However, While more exhaustive than translation, localization implies a unidirectional social process, taking a cultural object already manufactured abroad, in this case in Japan, and then tailoring it to local, in this case American, tastes. As a concept, it does not take into account the possibility of bi- or multidirectional processes, the possibility, in other words, that being published in English might come to affect manga at its initial moment of production in Japan. What does Brienza mean? Well, we're going to have to introduce a little theory, so bear with me. A common way of imagining the process by which a work produced by a national culture, in this case anime produced in Japan, is then made available for another culture, in this case the United States, would involve an intersection of those two cultures in what Brienza calls a transnational field, an intermediary space. The limitation of this model is that the transnational is embedded within both national fields, the implication being that anyone working within this field, like a translator, would be within both fields simultaneously. This is demonstrably not how it works, and so Brienza refines this model by extracting the transnational field and making it its own intermediary space. This better, improved model conceives of a transnational field that is simultaneously overlapping with and distinct from its constituent national fields, while preserving the view that the national fields can in turn be influenced by the presence of the transnational. This intermediary space, then, is where the companies which produced anime for American, or broadly the Anglosphere, market operate. Brienza also adds a third component to the model, directionality, which explains how culture is made to flow from one cultural field to the next. By directionality, I mean that transnational cultural fields develop for movement from one national field to another, and not, at least necessarily, the reverse. With this in mind, we can shift to the term Brienza proposes, owing to the theoretical shortcomings of the terms already discussed. Thus, when a Japanese manga is published in English in the United States, it may be said to have become domesticated. The Oxford English Dictionary provides the following four-part definition for the verb to domesticate. To make or settle as a member of a household, to cause to be at home, to naturalize. To make to be or to feel at home, to familiarize. To make domestic, to attach to home and its duties. To accustom, an animal, to live under the care and near the habitation of man, to tame or bring under control, to civilize. To live familiarly or at home with, to take up one's abode. She argues that domestication offers a more comprehensive and theoretically robust appellation which precisely explains these variegated processes better than translation or localization. As a verb, it may signify both action and ongoing state of being, which allows me to discuss domestication in terms of both the production of new social practices and its maintenance across time and space. It is also transitive, which means that one can domesticate as well as be domesticated, and the sense in which humans exert their own will on other living, often non-human things, in order to domesticate them for specific instrumental ends, allows me to think about an asymmetrical configuration of power, the manifestations of deliberate force, and the desire to control. This is a causative construction, i.e., made to domesticate or be domesticated. Naturally, it may also be used reflexively, i.e., domesticating oneself, and domestication, unlike localization, need not be a unidirectional process. I think the greatest strength of domestication as the concept to explain the process of making anime available to the Anglosphere is that it is able to account for both the specific historical developments which have occurred over the last 30-odd years, as well as the contemporary state of the American anime industry. Recognizing it as a process which is continually ongoing and which extends outside the confines of an individual episode or series, Brienza sums this up succinctly. In short, To study domestication is to study an entire transnational cultural field, and to see that what it does is not merely textual translation from one language to another, or straightforward importation of objects from one country to another, but rather a complex, organized, collective process. Fundamentally, I also think that the collective aspect of domestication necessarily extends beyond the confines of what would normally be thought as the American anime industry, and can therefore be leveraged to incorporate the culture of scanlation, fan subbing, and the fan community which these products are ostensibly produced for. What domestication also acknowledges is that the product which is produced at the end of the process is something that is distinct from the original product first produced in Japanese, and that these forces of cultural production are able to reverberate back up the chain of transnational cultural production to ultimately influence the culture of origin itself. But that's enough theory. Let's return to the fledgling days of hentai distribution in the US to see how this process actually occurred. If you recall, one of the claims made in the Anime Artform pertains to an agreement between animators and distributors in the anime industry to not depict pubic hair on their characters. Now, this might strike you as a bizarre bit of information to include in a PSA about anime, even erotic anime, but there's a very good reason for its inclusion, which was unique to the cultural moment these videos were released in. While the trend in the American AV industry had been moving towards the total removal of pubic hair, neatly trimmed patches on AV actresses were still fairly common. The presence of pubic hair was also a visual signifier that the individual being depicted was clearly an adult. In fact, one of the major criticisms of the trend of pubic hair removal, both among AV stars and its growing popularity among the general public at the end of the millennium, was that it was attractive to male viewers precisely because it signified prepubescence. If the goal of Anime 18 was to present a convincing case that the characters being depicted in these hentai were over the age of 18, the absence of one of the most common signifiers of sexual maturity presented a problem. But why was there an absence of pubic hair on these characters to begin with? Well, owing to specific legal codes and ordinances in Japan, genitalia in erotic works must always be censored when produced for sale to the Japanese market. Specifically, Article 175 of the Japanese Criminal Code, the ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟, which is known as the Obscenity Clause. Regarding the depictions of pubic hair, unlike genitalia, there was never any kind of official ban, but works depicting pubic hair might have invoked the ire of censors who were looking for any reason at all to ban the sale of works deemed obscene, and so it became an informal convention of sorts, which, for a period starting in the 90s, did begin to loosen. So while the Anime Artform was not necessarily wrong about this, there's a much more practical reason as well. When mangaka and erodoujin artists published their works, there were several options available to censor genitalia. For example, Toshio Maeda, the creator of the original La Blue Girl manga, favored obscuring as well as erasure. Eroanime, on the other hand, was limited to either blacking out the area or what would become the industry standard, pixelating the area with a mosaic effect. Owing to these legal restrictions, when MTV, no, not that MTV, despite what AniDB, ANN, and Mal have to say, and later Studio Flagship, was animating La Blue Girl, they knew any detail would be covered up, and so including any kind of detailed anatomy, let alone pubic hair, would have been a waste of time and effort. With that said, given there is a sequence in La Blue Girl where the heroine uses her pubic hair as a last-ditch defensive projectile, the essay's point was undercut somewhat. One of the major selling points of Anime 18 releases, and something that would have a profound effect on ero anime broadly, was that their videos were marketed as uncensored, as we've already discussed. Well, as it turns out, Anime 18 titles of this vintage were not uncensored, at least not when compared to later ero anime titles released from the early 2000s through 2014. No, Anime 18 titles were decensored. Anime 18 was given copies of the original masters produced by distributor Dai, and so the native mosaic was never there in the first place, exposing the genital area. One of the interesting aspects of ℍ𝕖𝕟 anime of this era, something that can really make you appreciate the artistry of the animators, is that while the detailing was considerably more rudimentary compared to the highly detailed renderings of breasts, what was drawn was done in such a way as to be far more evocative through the filter of the mosaic than if the space had simply been left blank. This can't be shown on YouTube, but if you compare the Anime 18 version against the version released by Dai, this becomes quite apparent. Of course, it is relatively difficult to find digital copies of the original Japanese version of The Blue Girl, as every major hentai streaming and torrenting site has a rip of the Anime 18 DVD release from 2002. I've already mentioned that there was the 1995 VHS release of The Blue Girl, which was subtitled in English, and this version was both decensored and uncut. However, and again according to the Central Park Media Panel from 2000, and through comparisons of the sub and dub of the original Japanese, any segments with the character Nin, an adult but of diminutive height, engaged in sexual activity or with exposed genitalia, was cut from the 1996 dub release and subsequent re-release on DVD for fear that he could be mistaken as a minor. This is obviously an overt act of censorship, but it was deemed necessary to be able to release these titles legally in the context of the US market. But rather than being an isolated incident, it's really just a logical conclusion of everything else we've discussed regarding the anime art form. Anime 18 went above and beyond to stack the deck in their effort to control the narrative among distributors, retail outlets, and individual consumers, to do everything in their power to ensure that all characters depicted in sexual conduct or in the nude are aged 18 years or older. No actual or identifiable minor was used in the creation of any character depicted herein. When fans think about censorship, I imagine they could easily point to the 3-odd minutes of excised video involving Nin, or the fact that genitals were obscured in the original Japanese version. Yet, I doubt they would think about the effort made by Anime 18 to create and maintain the collective fiction about the age of characters being depicted in sexual acts. But these were decisions made by those domesticating anime for an American audience, and these decisions do impact how viewers are able to interpret and understand hentai. The age of the characters within the narrative did not matter. Girls in high school were aged up to be in college. A short man was transformed into a child, and this was all accomplished outside the text itself. The kayfabe was maintained through messages prefacing the video, the VHS slipcase, and marketing materials, which all established a paratextual framework that was influencing a potential viewer long before the video itself was ever seen. In this way, the American hentai superseded the original Japanese ℍ𝕖𝕟 anime, not for any ideological reason, nor moral squeamishness, but to simply make it legally available to the US market. So let's take a look at how much of a cascading effect these paratextual elements would have on all subsequent ℍ𝕖𝕟 anime domesticated into hentai for distribution to an American audience. While Central Park Media established Anime 18 in 1992, making it the first dedicated distributor for ℍ𝕖𝕟 anime in the US, other major distributors of the period followed suit. AD Vision launched Soft Cell Pictures in 1994, Media Blasters had its Kitty label, which was founded in 1997, the same year as the company itself, and eventually Right Stuff International with its Critical Mass label in 2003. From a distribution standpoint, the decision to have separate labels to license and market videos which would be considered pornographic was the necessary precondition for their release in the US market. Existing retail markets had long had a bifurcated stream. Larger rental chains typically did not offer pornography, though smaller local chains may have had an adult section, while adult video rental stores operated alongside more generalized ones. Anime 18 was very much aware of the fact that there was a deep-seated cultural bias in the US that animation was understood to be for children, so every effort was made to inform a potential consumer that the content of these videos was not intended for children, which was the origin of the warning "absolutely not for children" label. a warning which would, in turn, be adopted by their competitors as well. The natural and lasting consequences of the decision to regulate hentai to its own spaces was that while it has obviously been present since the early days of US anime distribution, it would remain, in essence, a dirty little secret. At best, offering adult material to those fans who wanted it, and, at worst, being used by journalists and moral censors to denigrate all anime as violent pornography, and Japan as a nation of sexual deviants, a legacy that has been difficult to dislodge from the popular consciousness. Did Anime 18 and other labels leverage this infamy to sell their products to a market that was nevertheless eager for it? Well, there will always be a market for individual consumer purchases, as previously mentioned, it was through independent adult video stores that hentai would find its most lucrative audience. Sales figures for this period are no longer available, but there are numerous indications that the sale of hentai would only become more profitable as the decade wore on and entered into the new millennium. Central Park Media would act as the distributor for Anime 18 titles, which appeared in almost all of their catalogs published between 1996 and 2002, and the adult section of these catalogs would continue to grow. In 2003, Anime 18 began to publish its own catalogs and would continue to do so until the company, along with Central Park Media, folded in 2008. It's easy to determine that these catalogs were intended for retail sales, as the retail number was always more preeminent than the one for consumers. There were also marketing materials made available to potential retailers as well. It is worth mentioning that the Anime Artform would remain a staple of every Anime 18 release from 1996 until the company folded, albeit, in the age of DVD, it was included in the bonus material. However, I believe the most convincing evidence of the success of hentai being domesticated for the US market was the impact it would have on the production of ero anime in Japan. One of the key selling features of hentai of this period was the fact that it was marketed as uncensored, and while I've already discussed the complications of that claim, this was what the US market demanded. This demand was significant enough that the blacked out spaces and crudely decensored depictions would be replaced with fully rendered genitalia. The era of uncensored ero anime was made possible solely because the market forces in the US made it profitable enough for Japanese production companies to produce original masters which included detailed anatomy that would be appropriately censored for sale in Japan but left uncensored to be licensed to US distributors. And the reason that uncensored ero anime appears and then disappears was directly tied to the collapse of the US video rental market, coupled with both legal and bootleg versions of US releases of hentai being imported back into Japan, competing with the ero anime they were derived from, to the effect that the losses being generated were significant enough to cut into domestic profits. Hentai that was illegally distributed in the US had such a strong pull that it necessitated an otherwise unthinkable change to domestic production practices in Japan, a change that was reversed once that pull disappeared. I hope it also demonstrates why the process of making anime available to a US audience should not, or rather cannot, be reduced to mere translation of a script. I think it is reasonable to assert that this perspective is one that has become deeply entrenched in Anglo-fan discourse, that all a licensor needs do is produce as direct a translation of the original Japanese source as possible, and that's it. There were, of course, contingent developments within unofficial distribution networks that precipitated this ideal becoming an article of faith among a significant portion of Anglo-anime fandom. However, this ideal, rather than providing insight into the process of domestication, has rather obscured the process of fan-subbing, anime, and scanlaning manga. One of the really interesting aspects of any media form is examining the way it has developed within the limits of production and how those limits have shaped the media in question. The previous section was titled The Art of Censorship, and I wasn't kidding. The reality of censorship in Japan necessitated incredibly creative responses, which left an indelible mark on the production of ero manga and ero anime. However, within the context of the US market, the content of censorship emerged in a much different manner than it did in Japan. Thus, Aro works had to be fundamentally altered to suit not only the legal restrictions already discussed, but also the aesthetic considerations of the US consumer. I've already discussed how Aro anime production incorporated specific design choices to maximize the erotic potential under conditions of censorship, and how censorship has influenced the development of many erotic expressions originating within Aro manga and Aro anime, yet the demand among US consumers of hentai was not for this authentic viewing experience, but rather erotic work which reflected the existing visual language of AV media already being consumed. This, coupled with the paratextual aspects in direct cuts made to accommodate the legal framework for the US market, necessitated an alteration of the source material which resulted in a fundamentally different product. Given this background, it's no surprise that while many erotic expressions which emerged with the spread of hentai have been adopted and incorporated into domestically produced erotic animation and comics, the forms of censorship which necessitated many of the same expressions has not. The way that Aro anime has been distributed, marketed, produced, and reproduced for the US market provides a number of complicating factors to the fan ideal of direct transmission. As it turns out, what fans want, rather than the most authentic translation of the original Japanese work, is a reproduction which appeals to their particular aesthetic and erotic sensibilities. Now, it needs be said that the continuing popularity of hentai among US fans attests to the fact that the return to censored Aro works has presented no barrier to consumption, though I would argue that this is because of necessity rather than desire. After all, hentai streaming sites, particularly those with paid memberships, continue to market uncensored titles. Considering that Faku, the largest legal distributor of hentai manga in English, publishes its titles uncensored, I have yet to find anyone complaining about these domesticated releases. The heroic effort of John Cirabella and Kitty Media almost single-handedly keeping the release of hentai to DVD and Blu-ray alive notwithstanding, I think it is safe to say that were the legal distribution of hentai to return in full force, the second coming of uncensored Aro anime would surely be upon us. I initially started making this video because I wanted to make more people aware of a unique artifact from a bygone era of anime history. However, as my research progressed, it became quite evident that this also presented an opportunity to introduce some interesting theory emerging from anime and manga studies to a broader audience. So, if nothing else, I hope this video has introduced a little complexity into how you understand that what is normally presented as a straightforward process is anything but, and that, rather than emerging as a byproduct of the growing popularity of anime, the process of domestication has instead been a key component of driving that popularity from the very beginning. And to think, it started with an obscure video essay that concluded by thanking you for supporting the Anime Artform. I don't believe the staff working at Anime 18 had the slightest idea how significant those words would turn out to be. Thanks for your time.